We discovered that really there had been a whole network of US government-funded organizations, of traditional news media companies, law enforcement, national security organizations that were really, to use the word, conspiring, coordinating behind closed doors to not only censor but also really to spread misinformation.
Michael Shellenberger, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So in December 2022, you were one of the reporters who released section of what was called the Twitter files, authorized by Elon Musk. You showed that the company was engaging in censorship for what looked like political reasons. Can you take us a little bit behind the scenes and tell us how that even happened, how you became one of the reporters to cover that story?
Sure. I was actually invited in by Barry Weiss. It must have been early December. Matt Taibbi had already written, I think, a couple of threads, including on the Hunter Biden laptop. And Barry was the second reporter to get in there, and she knew I lived in San Francisco. She knew I lived in the San Francisco Bay Area. I actually live in Berkeley. She respected my work and just invited me over. And as soon as she said, "Can you come?" Didn't even bother taking a shower first. Just jumped in the car and drove over, and it was very exciting. I had never met Elon Musk. I had actually been pretty critical of his supply chains around both solar panels and lithium batteries up until then. But as soon as I walked in, actually before I even saw Barry, he was there at the coffee station, and I introduced myself. And he said he didn't know who I was, but he was very welcoming. And we just got in this kind of airless conference room, as you might imagine, and we're just starting to get fed, a lot of the information that we had requested or they had requested, and we started to map out what we wanted to look at. So we were looking at sort of big controversies that we knew had occurred. And we already looked at the Hunter Biden laptop decision, the decision to censor it by Twitter staff. So then we had moved on to the decision to deplatform President Trump, which was made, he was deplatformed on January 8th, so 2 days after the January 6th Capitol riot. And being the kind of more junior member of the trio of reporters, they assigned me January 7th. But that turned out to be a pretty essential day, because that's when a lot of the discussions occurred within Twitter around justifying deplatforming the president, even though, according to their own analysis, he had not violated any of Twitter's terms of service, any of their internal rules. So it was a really interesting, exciting time. The big twist in it all was that we're discovering obviously a very progressive bias within the Twitter staff. So what people had suspected turned out to be true. But really the floor drops out from us when we start to see a lot of requests from people at the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security and so-called other government agencies, including the CIA, to take action to remove and censor content. And that was when I think really things started to change for us, and we realized there was a lot more going on here than just a kind of biased content moderation.
And based on your reporting and your analysis and what you saw, did that kind of change your perspective on censorship more generally, or how social media platforms engage in censorship?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there was definitely some chills up the spine moment when you start to see U.S. government officials requesting censorship. I'm not a First Amendment scholar. Free speech is honestly not something I had thought a whole lot about. It never seemed like something that needed to be defended, because we do have such a strong First Amendment protection. But we felt like, it's that excitement, which is sort of a mixture of fear and anxiety, but also some, joy at kind of something new appearing. And then that opened up a whole world where we discovered that really there had been a whole network of US government-funded organizations, of traditional news media companies, law enforcement, national security organizations that were really, to use the word, conspiring, coordinating behind closed doors to not only censor but also really to spread misinformation. So the people that were claiming the need to have more censorship of misinformation were actually spreading misinformation. And we saw that in multiple cases, including around COVID vaccines. We saw it around the Hunter Biden laptop. And in other instances, and I think that was when we started to realize that the censorship story wasn't just about one or two social media companies that really there was something broader going on, both in the culture but also as a reaction from elites.
And you've written about how there's been kind of like a rise in these regulatory measures also that are fighting misinformation or so-called disinformation or whatever. Do you have any sense of why this is happening, why there's more censorship now, why there's more kind of motivation to do something about these kinds of things?
Sure. I mean, I think part of it comes, there's a genuinely cultural movement, and we call it cancel culture. You call it genuinely from, I would say ordinary people, but we're really talking about educated folks. It's not the people that work in factories or are bagging your groceries that are demanding censorship. It's people that went to college, that have PhDs, that work at news media organizations, that work for the social media companies. They work in universities. These are highly educated people. They're sophisticated people. They understand how big organizations work. And it was those folks that we had seen over the last 10 years in particular start to demand that people's, Hollywood deals be canceled, their book deals be canceled, they be fired from newspapers. I mean, that cancel culture is a real thing, real genuine grassroots phenomenon. But then what we saw with the censorship industrial complex, so to speak, which is this network of organizations, is that you were then seeing government contractors and government agencies sort of tapping into that culture and using the similar justifications for censorship, including, most importantly, reducing harm, reducing harmful misinformation. And so I would say that was a big part of it. I think another part of it was this idea that, we just have a lot of very educated people in our society that are often looking for reasons, to have meaning in their lives. And some of those folks were involved in military and intelligence organizations and had successfully waged the war on terrorism after 9/11, including on the use of social media platforms by groups like ISIS. And they were very successful. And I think after really you get to 2016, which I think is the other big moment in the story, where you see voters in Britain voting to exit the European Union and Brexit, and you also saw the election of Donald Trump, two elections that really defied what the establishment, what the elites in those nations had wanted. They then misattributed the success of those two votes, or their own loss of those two votes, to social media platforms. I think it's important to point out that really no reputable political scientist actually thinks that Donald Trump won because of Facebook. We know that something like 70% of Republican voters got their news from Fox News, just 7% from Facebook. So whatever Russian activity existed in 2016 was just drowned out by other media communications. Similarly with Brexit, it was misattributed to Facebook. But nonetheless, the misattribution of those two, of Brexit and Trump, to social media was sort of used as a predicate to demand a crackdown on so-called mis and disinformation. So I think it's probably those three factors: the establishment of cancel culture, the post 9/11 establishment, and then the revolutions of 2016.
And you mentioned that you're not a First Amendment scholar, and you probably didn't intend to be this advocate for free speech. No. And I wonder, you mentioned how there's this argument that, speech is harmful and so on. And we obviously see that in academic institutions as well. What's your kind of general sense of why there's this, sense that speech can be harmful? And do you think that, what do you think we can do about it?
Yeah, sure. I mean, in some sense, I think my own views on free speech and First Amendment issues had sort of frozen from my adolescence. When I was a boy, my father would talk sort of admiringly, but also, I think, a little shocked by the ACLU, which had defended the right of neo-Nazis to march through a neighborhood in Skokie, Illinois, which had a large number of Holocaust survivors. I mean, if you want to talk about a form of speech that would be hurtful, and a kind of disinformation involving Holocaust denial, that would be it. And it was defended by the ACLU. The year I graduated from high school, 1989, the Supreme Court upheld the right of Americans to burn the flag against the objections of mostly Republicans and conservatives. And that was something I strongly supported. I was a rather un-American, radical left-wing kid. And so for me, the First Amendment was, and free speech was associated with being on the left. I did not work in my 30 years of political advocacy on First Amendment issues. So when all of this started to happen, I was surprised that Democrats were so strongly in favor of broader censorship. And I have now looked into it more because it's been a few months. And I think one of the most important pieces of research is this idea of what's called concept creep by psychologists, which is that what people consider to be harmful has massively expanded, not just in the United States, but really across the Western world. So you just hear it a lot. I mean, people will just define offensive language as harmful, or things that just express political differences are viewed as harmful. And it's been very well documented phenomenon, not a single study, but multiple studies over time documenting this. So I think that's in some ways the main event, because social values really do kind of determine broader sets of opinions. Then there's a sort of a more kind of narrow political objective, which Democrats have used to effectively try to discredit their political opponents, Republicans and conservatives, but also it's really particularly against populist and nationalist conservative movements. However, we have also now seen it also targeting more radical left-wing anti-war movements. And then also in COVID, we saw it targeting folks that were opposed to the lockdown. So I think there's both a cultural, social values, organic quality to it, but then also I think a top-down instrumental desire for censorship as a kind of political tactic.
And can you say a little bit more about kind of like your ideological evolution, or even say whether you even consider it to be an evolution? Did you kind of have some kind of awakening one day and decide, like, there's certain issues that are more important to me than other issues? Or in general, kind of like, how did you grow up politically and come to your opinions?
Yeah, I would say my own political evolution has been pretty gradual, punctuated by some important moments. I went to Latin America when I was a teenager, and I didn't live in poverty, but I experienced poverty, lived without running water and that sort of thing, and saw how hard life was for people without what we would consider modern civilization, electricity, roads, water. And so I was never somebody that romanticized poverty. I started working on climate change and environmental issues in earnest really in the late 1990s and the early 2000s. And the biggest change there was that I knew that we needed a technical solution to climate change. In other words, I didn't think the solution was to just become a lot poorer. But the big change was I came to believe that nuclear power was going to be important to replacing fossil fuels, and that using solar panels and wind turbines were just grossly inadequate. Like, it just didn't pencil out when you looked at the land use impacts and the cost and the unreliability because they're intermittent. And that was a big change, because nuclear for me in the 1980s, for many people of my generation, nuclear was associated with nuclear weapons and nuclear war. We were, I think, victims of a certain amount of propaganda around nuclear. It was the 80s, and there was more concern that there could be some kind of nuclear exchange between the US and the Soviet Union. And we saw, I think, made for TV movies that were, I think they were sort of, I mean, I don't want to, the word trauma gets used a lot, but they were quite shocking for kids to see. They were showing images of children being killed in nuclear blasts. So that same trauma, I think, that the baby boomers had in the 1950s with the duck and cover activities, they did it to Gen Xers. So to then change your mind and say, well, really, nuclear power plants are not the same as nuclear weapons was pretty significant. And beyond its import on the actual technology, it required that you understood why I was so misled about it, why I believed it, the ways in which our own reasoning is so affected by background ideas that are often spiritual in nature. So that nuclear, I think, had, and still for many people, plays as a kind of demonic force, replacing as a kind of secular devil, and renewables as a kind of, a kind of spiritual harmonization. So when you realize that really didn't make sense, and it really didn't fit how these technologies work in the real world, that, I think, then opened me up to reconsidering a number of other things, including my own views of things like free markets and liberal democracy. And I moved away from my own affection for socialism and for more radical revolutionary ideas. There were other things that I don't think I've changed on, and one of them was freedom of speech. And so in some ways, this issue that I'm working on now, I kind of think I haven't changed very much and other people have changed. So I think it really just depends on the issues that we're looking at.
Yeah. And going back to your Twitter files, it's hard to imagine even a few years ago independent journalists being invited to cover such a big story. I wanted to ask you a little bit about your thoughts on this kind of massive change and the rise of independent journalism and maybe the decline of legacy media. Or maybe it's not a decline. I'm curious what you think. But how did those things kind of stand now, and where do you see them kind of going in the future?
Yeah, I mean, I think I was sort of surprised. I mean, my sense when I started working on the Twitter files was, well, at some point the mainstream news media will cover this, and that will be how people find out about it. And it was really Matt Taibbi, who's become a friend since I met him in the Twitter files, who said, he said it's probably not going to work like that. And when you just look at how many people are reading the Twitter files, it doesn't really have to work like that. I mean, the official view count on the Twitter thread that I did on Hunter Biden's laptop, it's somewhere around 100 million. I think that's probably, an overestimate because it may be counting people that go back a couple times or whatever. But even if it's a tenfold exaggeration and it's only 10 million people that read it, well, that's more people than read articles in the New York Times or other publications. And we just know for a fact that a lot of people saw it, even though it didn't make the mainstream news media. I think the second consequence of it, and we know this from research too, is that when people see information from a different source and that they don't see from a news outlet that they rely on, it reduces their trust in that news outlet because they feel like something has been withheld from them. So I think that ultimately the Twitter files and much of other information that the news media haven't properly covered or have covered wrong and have gotten wrong, I think it has served to undermine their credibility and legitimacy with many Americans. And we see that from the polling data too. So you just see the more partisan nature of news media outlets where the so-called mainstream news media are just much more trusted by Democrats and progressives, with conservatives and Republicans trusting outlets like Fox. It's interesting to me that Fox itself now is, I think, in a real state of crisis because their most important anchor has left and is now Tucker Carlson. He's now broadcasting on Twitter. So we're in a moment of very significant change. I personally think it's also a golden age of journalism and of independent writing. There's stuff that's being published on Substack and on Twitter directly on those platforms that are breaking stories that are clearly superior to what you're able to read in the mainstream news publications. Much of the mainstream news publications just often act as sort of state propaganda. It may seem like a harsh term, but really articles that basically just repeat the official line from the White House or the FBI or the CIA. And I think that ends up starts to raise questions about whether those are really mainstream news media, whether those are really independent news media, or whether really we're back to a place that we were more before World War II at the beginning of the 20th century, where we had many more news media choices that people had for a variety of their different political affiliations. I think that the other consequence of the social media revolution is just that people end up having a relationship of trust with some particular individuals. So Barry Weiss, Matt Taibbi, Mike Shellenberger, Glenn Greenwald, these are people who, these are all people I just named that all have some sort of affinity with each other, but there's also a different flavor to each of us. And then there's other people that don't easily fit on left-right spectrums. So you have publications like Tablet or Compact, which I think are really exciting publications, and you read them and you can't figure out if it's a left-wing or a right-wing publication or article or an author. So I do think that this fragmentation of the news media and the rise of independent news media is happening along with a sort of scrambling of the traditional left-right political identities. And it's what, part of me, I have a very dark view in some ways of the censorship and what's going on in the societies. I'm worried about Western civilization, but I'm also just thrilled by what's going on in terms of media, journalism, and independent thought. I just got back from London, and it was just absolutely bubbling with new ideas and events, and there's real conversations going on, and it's not happening in an atmosphere of hostility, but rather openness. So there's some ways in which I just think, yeah, it's the worst of times and the best of times.
And I wonder, from a consumer point of view, a news consumer point of view, what advice you have, because for all the excitement and the advantages of having this proliferation, from a consumer point of view, it's also kind of like the wilderness, and you know that you can't go to one institution to get the news. So what kind of advice do you have to consumers of media to find reliable information and not be sucked into like rabbit holes and conspiracy theories and whatnot?
Yeah, I mean, I think there isn't a real hard and fast rule about it. I think we're definitely in a new view of truth. And Friedrich Nietzsche once talked about how that our view of truth should be with many eyes, meaning many sources of information, many different perspectives. And so get different takes on these news. Elon Musk at Twitter has sort of increased, I think, the use of a project called Community Notes, where people can rate the veracity of different tweets. In some ways, it's unnecessary because you can already have replies to tweets, but in other ways, it's an interesting experiment because it does allow people with different political persuasions to vote, and there's some sort of algorithmic method to try to sort things out. But I think that, for example, we are playing with both giving away free information and charging for information. And so one of the old ideas, actually it's very old, but was this famous aphorism from Stuart Brand, which was that information wants to be free, but he always pointed out that everyone forgot the second part, which is that it wants to be expensive too. And so I do think that there's a chance to get a lot of free information. I also think people can make different choices about what they want to spend their money on. You can get a lot of free information out there. Social media is just so game-changing in the particularly Twitter, I think, in the quantity of information that you can absorb in terms of just getting many more headlines from many different sources than you can from a traditional news outlet by the New York Times. So yeah, I think maintain that attitude of skepticism and openness, and recognize that there's a way in which these stories, they're never done. That there is never a settled issue, and science is never settled, never should be settled, because reality continues to change and our understanding of it changes with it.
So where does that leave new institutions? Because if we have this proliferation of independent journalists and companies, what's the role of new institutions? Do they have a role in media and education? Should there be new institutions? Should there be new media institutions? What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that we are in a crisis of civilization. In some ways, it's cyclical. I see ourselves in a period very much like the 1970s. You remember in the 1970s, there was something called the Church Commission to deal with abuses of power in the federal government by the FBI, by the CIA. Some of that is starting to happen. I think we need to see more of it. I think we're starting to see some of the abuses of power that occurred under COVID. I'd like to see that be a little bit more bipartisan than it has now. I think we're also obviously in a huge cyclical change in terms of the news media. And then I think we're in a huge change in terms of the status of the academy. And so you see universities becoming places of indoctrination, places of dogma, places of rigidity that just perpetuate the same old ideas rather than being a place that are open to new entrants. And so that's a big part of the reason I'm so excited about the University of Austin. It's attracting world-class thinkers, really interesting people that are not often very educated people, but also people that may not be at universities or maybe disaffected from universities. They might be more public intellectuals rather than academic intellectuals. I think that it's very, I hope there's many more University of Austins, and that University of Austin continues to grow and expand, because I do think students are hungry for it. They're hungry for real learning. There's an atmosphere of fear rather than an atmosphere of curiosity at universities. Young people and also professors are scared of saying or writing the wrong thing. They should be scared of repeating the wrong thing, of simply reciting conventional wisdom rather than seeking something new and being comfortable being wrong, testing out ideas. I think one of the models is to think about that this is about creating a new university is about creating a place that's much more like the kind of comfort that you have with friendships, when you're with friends, you can test out ideas. You can say, I'm not really sure if I think this or not, but here's how I'm feeling about something. And then you can have a reaction. No one's going to hold you to it. No one's going to politicize it or demonize you or bully you for those views. And yet that is often how people feel, including at very elite institutions, the Ivy League institutions and others. So for me, University of Austin, as soon as it was announced, was something I knew I wanted to be a part of in any way, because I felt like clearly the culture is hungry for it. And just now that I've been here a day or two, you can see that there's real hunger and desire for being able to be in that kind of atmosphere.
And last question. So you've had a lot of beats over your career. You've covered a lot of issues. What's next? What can we look forward to?
That's a great question. Definitely the two big areas that I've worked on in my career have been energy and the environment, and then drugs, crime, and homelessness more recently, at least in the last 5 years. The freedom of expression and censorship are very exciting and interesting to me. They're partly because there's so many different things that are being censored and so many different disinformation campaigns that are being waged. So we just did a piece today on the World Health Organization, a proposed new pandemic treaty. I'm very interested in stories that arouse a lot of public interest, but might be covered in a kind of conspiratorial way or in a sort of paranoid way. I often find there's a lot of truth to those things and people just go too far, but that if you really look at them, there's often something really interesting in there. But I'm very interested in, we have said our Substack publication, we call it Public. It's inspired by the name of Martin Gurry's great book, Revolt of the Public, which is about the rise of the internet. But our own internal philosophy is that we're really only interested in doing stories that are a little bit dangerous. Don't want them to be so dangerous that we end up in real trouble, but enough dangerous that they should be controversial, that there should be some of our own readers that are unhappy about what we're doing. There's, to give one example, there's a lot of controversy over UFOs, or what are called UAPs, anomalous phenomena that we can't really well describe. It triggers people, the topic itself, and we've received some hostile messages about it. But for us, I think it demonstrates our commitment to openness and to covering things that are controversial. Those are the things that most need to be covered. I had a friend that recently said, why do you only write about controversial things, or why is everything that you do is controversial? And it's because those are the only things really worth writing about. I mean, things that are where I'm in agreement with the majority or some settled issue, at least for now, are less interesting to me than issues where we have, I think, a more minority take on it or a more controversial take.
Michael Shellenberger, thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me.